So the animal phyla that we've looked at so far are the Porifera, the sponges, which are the outgroup to the rest of the animals. And then the Cnidaria, which is one of the radially symmetrical groups of animals that you see out here. Well, there are a few other phyla out on this side of this tree. Almost all of the metazoans are derived from an organism that is triploblastic, that is, it has three tissue layers and developed bilateral symmetry. There are a few groups of animals that have secondarily lost bilateral symmetry over evolutionary time, but essentially all of the organisms we're going to be talking about from here on are bilaterally symmetrical and cephalized. There are two major clades within the bilaterally symmetrical organisms in the animals. One of them is called the protostomes, and that's what's shown here in purple. All of these organisms shaded red and blue, and that's most, of course, of the animal kingdom are protostomes. There's a small group over here called the deuterostomes, which we're interested in mostly because it includes the chordates. The vertebrates, including mammals, are part of the chordates, and so we'll be spending a lot of time on that group later on. We first want to introduce you to a group called the flatworms, or the Platyhelminthes. All of these four groups right here are protostomes, and these are the three that we're going to be covering today. The flatworms are a very curious group. As their name suggests, they are more or less worm-like. No limbs, lots of them are very long and sort of rounded, but usually rather than rounded, they are flat. And this is an adaptation to deal with the increasing problems of surface area to volume ratios as an organism gets larger. That flat shape has a larger surface area for the same amount of volume. These are generally relatively long animals. They can be very small, but they actually can be quite large. Some of these flatworms are multiple meters long. Some of them are free living, but a lot of the ones that human beings are most concerned with are parasites. Some of these can be very significant parasites. They can be lethal to humans, and even those that are not do impose a pretty serious load on human health worldwide. Again, the organisms that we've seen so far have been either asymmetrical or radially symmetrical. That is, that there's a single axis of symmetry around which any number of planes can be constructed that cut the organism into essentially mirror image halves. Bilaterally symmetrical organisms have only a single plane of symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is strongly correlated with cephalization. And cephalization, in turn, is strongly correlated with an active lifestyle. It makes sense, if you are going to move around actively, to have your sensory organs and therefore your nervous tissue concentrated up at one end of the body. That's the end of the body that is leading into a new environment. And you want to be able to sense that new environment as soon as you encounter it. Radially symmetrical organisms tend to be organisms that sit still and the environment comes to them, potentially from all sides. Even the sea jellies, which do float around, mostly rely on passive encounters with other organisms to keep themselves fed. Bilateral symmetry goes along with cephalization, because once you start moving around, it makes sense to have a front and a back, that is an anterior and posterior end. It's relatively straightforward for one of the sides to become the dorsal, the back side, and the other to become the ventral, the front side. This is particularly true if you're crawling around on a substrate, and it's that ventral or belly side that has to interact with that substrate. It makes sense that that side of your body is going to evolve to be adapted to move across substrate. Once you've had that adaptation, you're bilaterally symmetrical. What this does, all of these things do, is they make active movement possible. And that opens up a whole range of possible lifestyles. Most predatory organisms in particular are cephalized. They need to be able to find prey organisms and act quickly when they find them, because those prey may try to run away. This provides a lot of new ways of making a living, particularly if you're preying on other animals. They are made of the same stuff as you, and it's very efficient to eat them. However, they are also going to try to get away, and moving around is energetically quite costly. The Platyhelminthes, the flatworms, this first group among the protostomes that we're looking at, are much more complicated than the radiate animals. This middle tissue layer, the mesoderm, has developed into a wide variety of internal organs that work in a much more complicated way to support a more complicated organism. While the flatworms do not have a respiratory or circulatory system, that is, they rely on passive movement of materials through the body wall, they do have a number of other organ systems that are much more well developed. One thing is that they have a well-developed excretory system, but they also have a more elaborate digestive system. You should remember that in the sea jellies and the anemones, the cnidaria, there's a gastrovascular cavity that basically fills up the entire inside of the organism. What you're seeing here in pink is the gastrovascular cavity of a particular kind of flatworm. The gastrovascular cavity can look quite different in different types of flatworm, but in general, what you see is this very lobed structure that reaches throughout the inside of the entire organism. And no surprise here, this lobing and folding increases the surface area of the digestive system so that this organism can more efficiently transfer food into its body, into these blue cells that are the living cells, and it can more efficiently transfer waste out into that digestive system. The digestive system of the flatworms is incomplete. That is that there is one opening, the mouth here, that is also the anus. Another adaptation that you can see here that is significantly different than what you see in the cnidarians is a more complicated nervous system. You can have a relatively simple nerve net in flatworms, and that's not all that different from what you see in a sea jelly. But you also can have this much more complicated ladder-like configuration. And you'll notice that in the head end, where most of the sensory organs are, there are ganglia. There are these thicker areas, these clumps of nervous tissue that are there to deal with all of the sensory information that is coming in from the head end of the organism. And the development of a nervous center obviously is something that goes along with cephalization and the active lifestyle, because all of those sensory organs up at one end of the body are going to need nervous tissue nearby to rapidly and efficiently process all the information that they're taking in about the environment that the animal is moving into. The ability to move is much more complicated in flatworms than it is in sea jellies. You have muscles that run the length of the organism and cause it to shorten up. You have muscles around the organism, circular muscles, that cause it, when they're squeezed, they cause it to lengthen out. There are muscles that reach diagonally across the body that allow it to turn and crawl in more complicated ways. And accordingly, flatworms can crawl pretty much any direction they want to. They can direct their own movement, which is something you can't really say about a sea jelly. One of the most important groups, as far as human beings are concerned, that's in the flatworms are the flukes, because flukes are parasites that attack many different species, including livestock that we depend upon and human beings themselves. One of the things that's interesting about the flukes is that they have very complex life cycles often. In particular, these parasitic animals usually parasitize at least two different species during their life cycle. So at one point in the life cycle, they'll be found within one species of host, and then at another point in the life cycle, they'll actually be growing within a different kind of host. As adults, almost all the flukes are found within some kind of vertebrate. And because these are often organisms that we care about, either because we farm them or because they are us, this makes flukes a big deal medically. There are a number of features that you'll often see on parasites that you don't usually see on free-living organisms. So for example, on flukes, there is usually a sucker, or maybe more than one sucker, on the body that allows it to attach to its host. This is one of the problems that all parasites face. If they are separated from their host, life is going to be much more difficult for them, and in fact it may be fatal for them to be separated from their host. And so they have a tendency to hang on very tightly using some kind of attachment mechanism. You can see the suckers on this fluke here and here. It uses those to stick close to its host, which is its source of housing as well as its source of food. Other adaptations that you repeatedly see evolving when a free-living organism evolves to be a parasite is you see a loss of sensory systems. Most parasites, at least once they find their host, don't really have a need to sense their environment very much. And so the energy and nutrients spent building and maintaining sensory systems get shunted over to other activities. Most often those other activities involve reproduction. This is another trend you'll see in parasites, is they tend to have very, very high fecundity. And we'll be talking about why that is in just a minute. This is what the Chinese liver fluke looks like. This is an important parasite of human beings. Again, it's radically modified from the free-living flatworms because much of the inside of it is taken up by reproductive organs, and you see basically no sensory systems over here at the anterior end. It has an unusual lifestyle. I'm going to walk through it very briefly just to give you a sense of what the lifestyle of a parasitic fluke is like, and then we'll be talking a little bit about why it is. So this is the adult fluke here in the center, and it lives in the digestive system of a vertebrate, potentially a human being. This host, the host that houses the adult, is referred to as the definitive host. The life cycle can be said to start when that definitive host lays eggs. They pass out of the definitive host in its feces. They're shown here. Usually those feces are shed into water, and so the eggs end up floating in the water until they encounter vegetation. They stick to it, and if they are eaten by a snail, which is the intermediate host, the egg hatches. What follows then is a sequence of asexual reproductive events. You don't have to worry about the names of these different organisms, but basically there is a structure called a sporocyst that results from the hatched egg, and it internally will generate many, many genetically identical new forms that are called metacercariae. Each one of those metacercariae goes out and it feeds from the snail that it's found in, and it forms within itself many, many, many asexually produced forms called cercariae. The cercariae are a free swimming form. They are actually mobile. They can get around outside of the snail's body. And so what you've got essentially is these two rounds of asexual amplification. You start out with one egg inside a snail, but you can end up with hundreds and hundreds of these free-swimming cercariae, which are then released from the snail's body. They then swim out around in the water and search for a fish. When they find one, they bore through its side into its muscle tissue, and there they curl up in the muscle and form a resting stage that's called a cyst. That cyst just sits there in the muscle of the fish until the fish is eaten by the vertebrate that is the definitive host. At that point, the cyst essentially hatches out and develops into an adult fluke, and that starts the cycle all over again. So here are the metacercariae that are generated by the sporocyst. Here the cercariae swim. They form cysts if they are lucky enough to encounter a fish. And then that cyst hatches out in the digestive system of the definitive host. Why this extremely complex life cycle? Well, one of the difficulties involved in being a parasite is, probably the biggest difficulty, is finding a new host. And there are a couple of different adaptations that you see in parasites for doing this. One are these dramatically high fecundity in the first place. So a fluke can shed a tremendous number of eggs into the digestive system of its definitive host. The reason for having this intermediate host is presumably that within the intermediate host, each one of those eggs can go through multiple rounds of asexual reproduction. Because it does that, it really increases the chances of at least one of these cercariae finding this second host, this fish. And the fish is the way in which this parasite is going to make its way into the digestive system of another vertebrate. It's as though these cercariae are finding their way within bait for that definitive host. They're putting themselves inside something that other host is going to eat. But if it weren't for the intermediate host over here, each one of these eggs would have to become a cercaria by itself and then find a fish. And the odds of at least one of the offspring making this whole loop would be hundreds of times worse than it is when you've got this asexual reproduction within the snail. So it seems bizarre that a fluke would have such a complex life cycle, but it actually makes a certain amount of sense. It's how the fluke increases the odds that at least one of its offspring will eventually make its way into the digestive system of the definitive host. Tapeworms are also parasites in the Platyhelminthes, and they also lack a sensory system. In fact, they've taken this sort of reduction in features even farther. Tapeworms don't even have a digestive system. The reason they can get away with this is that they live in the digestive system of their host. The host digests all the food for the tapeworm simply has to absorb it. The tapeworm, just like the fluke, has most of its body mass devoted to reproduction. Each one of these little segment looking things is called a proglottid, and the proglottids basically contain reproductive organs. Again, what this does is it maximizes the chances of one of the eggs of a tapeworm being incredibly lucky enough to encounter a new host. By the way, the tapeworm is a very good example of an exception to the trend that evolution makes things more complicated over time. Evolution does not have to make organisms more complicated as time goes on. And in fact, there are many cases in which organisms evolve to be less complicated over time. This in particular happens when the added complicated features are not actually needed anymore. And that's exactly what's happening in the case of the tapeworm. Tapeworms can be a serious threat to human health. They also can become encysted in parts of their host. And if you get the wrong kind of tapeworm in your body, it can try to encyst itself in places that are not appropriate. In particular, you can get some species of tapeworm will try to form cysts in the eyeballs or the brain. And when these cysts form in the brain, it can not only be harmful, but it can actually kill you. What's shown here is a cross-section of a brain of a person who has many, many tapeworms encysted in their neural tissue. And you can see that the brain is basically just riddled with holes where these immature tapeworms have curled up and made little hollow holes in this brain. It's basically made the brain into Swiss cheese full of tapeworms, which I hope you never ever think of that mental image again.